Welcome back. Today will be a little bit different. Although we'll be talking about the Book of Mormon, we won't be talking about a specific set of chapters. Instead, we'll focus on one of the characters from the book of 1 Nephi. We'll be talking about Laman, Nephi's older brother, who is often seen as the story's antagonist or even a villain. And every villain has an origin story, and today we're going to talk about Laman's villain origin story. I should clarify up front that my objective is not to try to make Laman out to be a good guy, but instead to take a hard look at him and see if we might have misunderstood Laman, or if we can learn anything from watching his downward spiral. When we learn about the Book of Mormon, we usually learn that Nephi is the good guy and Laman and Lemuel are the bad guys. And it's true. Nephi's oldest two brothers eventually become murderous villains who teach their children to hate Nephi and his children. And we aspire to be like Nephi, and we might even assume that we're like him. We all want to think that we're the good guy, but you might find that you're a lot more like Laman than you think you are. And therefore, Laman's origin story becomes a much more personal, cautionary tale. But before we cover his origin story, let's take a look at his resume. He was the one who walked into Laban's house and sat down with him and asked for the brass plates. He and Nephi both hunted while they were traveling and put food on the table for everyone. And he did a lot of the building on the ship that took them to the promised land. Perhaps he needed encouragement to get started, but if you look at the things that he did, his resume of accomplishments is similar to Nephi's. Furthermore, he apparently loved his family and taught his children to love their families even more than Nephi's descendants did. In Jacob 3, Laman's younger brother, Jacob, compares Laman's descendants to those of Nephi. Verse 5, he says, "Behold, the Lamanites your brethren, whom ye hate because of their filthiness and the cursing which hath come upon their skins, are more righteous than you." And verse 7, "Behold, their husbands love their wives, and their wives love their husbands, and their husbands and their wives love their children." So for all of his faults, it looks like Laman might have done a decent job with his family. I was a little surprised to learn in reading through the Book of Mormon that Laman and Lemuel were usually not disobedient. Although the book shows them at their worst moments, if you create a timeline of 1 Nephi, Laman and Lemuel were righteous and obedient for most of the timeline. So now, let's walk through the origin story, and as we go, ask yourself if you would have done any better or handled things differently. The Book of Mormon begins with Laman's father having a dream, and after seeing this dream, he began preaching about a future Messiah in 1 Nephi chapter 1. They lived in Jerusalem, and this preaching caused the Jews living at Jerusalem to seek his life, so he and his family had to abandon everything and flee into the wilderness. This didn't just upset Laman, it upset the entire family, including Sariah, who was Lehi's wife, and also Nephi. So a family member or a church leader makes a public statement that puts your family's life in danger, or it costs your family its home. How would you handle that? Then Laman's father had another dream telling him to send his adolescent sons to the nation's capital to retrieve one of the city's most valuable treasures from one of its most powerful men. Specifically to get the city's official record, written on brass plates, from Laban, the man whose family was in charge of guarding them. Now, Laman, who we're talking about, said that this would be impossible, or, quote, a hard thing, quote. But he still went to Jerusalem. He probably doubted that Laban would hand over the record, but he trusted his dad. He met with Laban, and he asked him for the brass plates. Laban responded by calling him a robber, threatened to kill him, and threw him out into the street. He was disappointed and scared, shaken up, and wanted to go home. So, you do what your parents or what your leaders tell you to do, but that makes your situation worse. How do you handle that? Do you handle that better than Laman did? Next, Laman's younger brother suggested using their family's wealth to bribe Laban into giving them the plates. Laban was the oldest son, so the family's wealth that Nephi was proposing to use was his inheritance. Laman helped gather up his inheritance and carry it to Laban's house to try to bribe him into giving him the plates. Laban kept the bribe money and sent his servants to kill Laman and his brothers. They ran for their lives, and they had no choice but to leave the family's treasure there with Laban. Laman's inheritance was now gone, and Laban's servants were searching Jerusalem for Laman and his brothers so they could kill them. Laman and Lemuel were so angry that they beat their younger brother with a stick until an angel told them to stop. So you trust your younger brother's genius idea, and it costs you your inheritance, like all of your money. Are you good with that? Or do you hit him with a stick? Also, that's twice in a row now that you did what your leaders asked you to do, and each time the situation got worse. The first time you were threatened. The second time you lost your inheritance. And they sent someone to kill you. How would you handle that? The next episode in Laman's origin story is when he and Nephi were bringing Ishmael's family into the wilderness. One of Ishmael's daughters was Laman's fiancée, and they'd be getting married soon. She, her older brothers, and one of her sisters decided that they would rather take their chances at Jerusalem than relocate permanently to the desert. And Laman and Lemuel decided to stay in Jerusalem with them. So when Laman's younger brother Nephi started yelling at them that they needed to keep going into the desert, and he was quoting scriptures to make his case, they tied him up and left him laying on the ground in the wilderness. Eventually, Ishmael's wife calmed things down, and Laman repented and continued into the desert. So, your younger brother criticizes and lectures you in front of your fiancée and her family. How do you handle that? Do you tie him up? Or do you need some time alone to process? Would you have eventually repented and done what your little brother said, like Laman and Lemuel did? In 1 Nephi chapter 15, we find Laman and Lemuel arguing about the scriptures. They had some questions, and if you read the chapter, they understood the scriptures well enough to ask some good questions. But they were frustrated that God didn't answer their questions as quickly as he seemed to answer Nephi's, if he answered them at all. So, do you become frustrated when God doesn't answer your prayers? Nephi told them that if they kept the commandments, or in other words, if they were less wicked, God would make things known unto them. How would you feel about that kind of an answer? So what did Laman and Lemuel do? They repented, and sure enough, God did answer their questions. After they repented, they asked Nephi about their questions, and Nephi explained. And maybe I'm reading too much into this, but for those of us who are non-visionaries, maybe that's the way God makes things known unto us, by having someone else explain them to us. Okay, back to the story. Lehi's journey took the group through a land where no food could grow, and they had to hunt animals to stay alive. But then their hunting bows broke, and their families faced starvation. Laman was angry, and everyone but Nephi, including their father Lehi, was resigned and ready to give up. But after Nephi talked to them, they, quote, did humble themselves. Nephi then made a bow, went and killed enough food to keep them alive, and everyone was overjoyed. So Laman became angry when his family was threatened with starvation. But a pep talk put him back on track. How do you react to situations that threaten your family? Are you cheerful and optimistic and resourceful like Nephi was? Or do you need some time and some encouragement to get your head right after your initial reaction? Then Ishmael died. He was Laman's father-in-law, and this was way too much for Laman's wife. She and her sisters had already suffered plenty in the desert, and now their father was dead. Laman, Lemuel, and Ishmael's sons planned to kill Lehi and Nephi and put an end to the suffering. But God intervened and scolded them, so they repented, and soon they were back on track. So, they had followed their church leaders' instructions, which resulted in their family nearly starving to death and with their father-in-law dying. How would you react? But the worst part of the journey, apparently, was after Ishmael died, and they traveled east across what Laman and Lemuel referred to as some strange wilderness. We don't know a whole lot about this stretch of the journey, but we know enough. As Nephi phrased it, we lived upon raw meat in the wilderness. And I'll just point out that this didn't mean sushi, and it didn't mean rare steaks. And these weren't the animals that they brought with them either, because they had already used up all their stores by the time that Nephi broke his bow. Maybe they were lucky enough to occasionally bring down a gazelle, but they probably ate a lot of lizards and rodents, because that's what there is in the Arabian desert. And either way, whatever animals they were eating them raw. And I'm not trying to be gross, but this would have been the reality. If you're hungry enough to eat a raw rodent, you're eating the whole thing. And this went on for years. So you think you're Nephi, do you? Well, ask yourself how you'd handle that situation. You followed your dad into the desert, several years go by, and you're still in the desert. You look over, and your wife is helping your little 3-year-old to eat a raw gopher. How do you respond to that? Want to know how Nephi responded? Here's a direct quote from 1 Nephi 17:2. Quote, "And so great were the blessings of the Lord upon us, that while we did live upon raw meat in the wilderness, our women did give plenty of suck for their children." So great were the blessings, said Nephi, as he watched his child eating that raw gopher. If you're not thinking that you would have reacted that way, then you're probably not like Nephi. Can we pause for just a minute to acknowledge that Nephi really was not normal? I'm not saying this in a bad way, but if you're watching your wife and little kids eat raw mice, guts and all, and you're thinking about how blessed you are, that's not natural. That's not normal. Would you be in Nephi's headspace thinking about how blessed you are? Or would you be in Laman's headspace thinking that you'd be just fine, never eating another raw lizard ever again? And let's talk straight for a minute. I don't know that Laman was a villain as much as he was simply normal. In every situation we've talked about, Laman's reaction probably was the natural reaction. And maybe there's an important lesson there. God doesn't want us to be normal. He doesn't want our behavior to be natural. He expects better of us. We know from King Benjamin's talk that the natural man is an enemy to God, but do we need to be not natural in the same way that Nephi was? He lost the family fortune and was fine with it. He probably hated having to have hard conversations with his brothers, but he did it anyway. They ran out of food and he didn't complain, but immediately looked for solutions. He saw his family eating raw meat in the wilderness and considered it a blessing. Isn't all that a little bit much? Remember Nephi's dream where he saw the great and spacious building that represented the world and the wisdom thereof? Being like Nephi will probably involve doing things that make smart, educated people laugh at you and point at you and question your wisdom. Educated people will think that you are completely stupid and bizarre. But Nephi didn't care about any of this. He was all in. Are we all in? Are you all in? Here's a quote from Elder Jeffrey R. Holland in his April 2014 conference address titled, "The Cost and Blessings of Discipleship." Sadly enough, my young friends, it is a characteristic of our age that if people want any gods at all, they want them to be gods who do not demand much. Comfortable gods, smooth gods who not only don't rock the boat, but don't even row it. Gods who pat us on the head, make us giggle, and tell us to run along and pick marigolds. If you're doing it right, it's going to be hard. Speaking of boats, let's move to the next chapter in Laman's origin story. So after 8 horrible years, they reached paradise. After 8 years of watching their wives and children survive on raw meat, they reached a beautiful land on the seashore that not only had food, it had fruit, and it had wild honey. And it appears that Laman and Lemuel were content to watch the waves roll in and take some time off. After what they had just been through, can you identify with that maybe? But Nephi wanted to leave. He had never built a boat before, but he said he was going to build a large ship that their families would board, and then they would all cross the raging ocean together. Laman and Lemuel were done traveling at this point. They kicked back and told Nephi he could just build the boat himself. This led to an argument, with Nephi quoting scriptures at his brothers and his brothers threatening to throw Nephi into the ocean. There were bad feelings all around, quote, for the space of many days. The standoff ended when Nephi used God's power to shake his brothers, although he doesn't explain exactly what that means. Laman and Lemuel repented. They built the ship with Nephi, and they were impressed with the results. So impressed, in fact, that they were willing to board the ship with their families. Let me ask, has that ever happened to you? You were assigned to do something and you didn't feel like doing it. Maybe you grumbled a little bit. but then you did it anyway. And when you did it well, and you found that you kind of enjoyed it. Once again, that's just like Laman and Lemuel. Then, as one last example, although there's more, the group was all on the newly constructed ship. Laman and a few others tried to make the long trip bearable by singing and dancing. They also began drinking. Now, if I understand correctly, singing, dancing, and drinking is pretty much the standard itinerary for modern-day cruises. But they also became rude and obnoxious, and Nephi was worried that if they didn't knock it off, God would stop blessing them, so he asked them to tone it down. They were so sick of Nephi at this point that they tied him up and took control of the ship. Stormy weather arose and threatened to sink the ship, so they repented and released him. You're on a crowded ship for probably about a year. If we're being honest, I probably would have stirred up some trouble just out of sheer boredom. Maybe have some fun. Singing and dancing wouldn't be out of the question. How would you handle it? How did Nephi handle it? It doesn't say how he handled seasickness and boredom, but while his brothers had him bound hand and foot, he says he didn't complain. Instead, he says, quote, "I did look unto my God, and I did praise him all the day long." Is that what you would have done? In those examples that we just looked at, as I said before, I'm not trying to excuse Laman and Lemuel and the others or make them out to be good guys. I'm just suggesting that we probably react like Laman and Lemuel did a lot more than we would like to admit. Would we become angry if keeping the commandments led us to economic ruin? When a church leader gives us a poorly planned assignment, do we grumble about it, or do we try to salvage the assignment and make it successful? When following inspired counsel leads to a dead end, what's our reaction? How do we respond when a prophet or apostle publicly says something that makes people angry or even puts our home or family at risk? How should we respond? Nephi was just on a totally different trajectory, but he was on it by choice. When Lehi's preaching got the family kicked out of Jerusalem, he was upset, but unlike his brothers, he, quote, did cry unto the Lord. Here's 1 Nephi 1, chapter 2. And it came to pass that I, Nephi, did cry unto the Lord, and behold, he did visit me, and did soften my heart, that I did believe all the words which had been spoken by my father. Nephi was humble and prayed about it. He was somehow able to put aside his own wishes and let God's will happen. We're supposed to let God prevail, and as we've seen in this discussion, that can sometimes be really tough. Going through Laman's origin story made me ask myself some hard questions. First, did I really want to be like Nephi? Did I really want to be that smiling guy who never has a bad day and is excited, not just willing, but excited to keep all the commandments? How hard am I actually trying to be that guy? Or am I more inclined to be like Laman? To do all the stuff, but maybe grumble about it sometimes. To let dead ends, and I mean legitimate dead ends, stop me. To avoid uncomfortable situations. To not follow the prophet's instructions if they put me or my family in danger. And maybe that sort of thinking is how Laman justified his reactions, because family was clearly important to him. Remember what Jacob wrote about him way back at the beginning? The Lamanite husband, wives, and children all loved each other even more than the Nephites did. But yet, Nephi was able to stay by the tree of life, referring to Lehi's vision, and he was able to experience God's love. Nephi was doing what God wanted him to do. Laman never allowed himself to experience the fruit. He did a lot of good things, but his heart was never in it. So, after having reviewed Laman's origin story, ask yourself, are you more like Laman, or are you more like Nephi? That's all I have for today. So send this video to someone that you think needs it, or if you click like or subscribe or leave a comment, the YouTube algorithm will send the video to someone for you. Kinda. That's all I have for today. We'll see you next time.